Good morning. Are you joining? Okay, I'm waiting to see your face. All right, thank you. Bye. 68? Okay, very nice. Wonderful, thank you. Bye. Hi, Jake.
Hello, hello.
Good morning. Good morning. Hi, Bill. Hi, Jake.
Hello, hello. Trying to make
We
sure.
can do clear.
There we go. Okay, great.
So
That's much
Jake,
better.
Jake, do you have the ability to share screen?
I do not, but it will be JP doing it. But let me at least check to see if I have it. I do.
Okay.
I do have the option here, so hopefully at least JP coming in has that.
Fantastic.
It will come through him. Great.
Did Bill tell you there are 68 people online or registrants?
Yeah, well, I saw the 60 at least before, so yeah, 68.
Good.
Yeah, great to know.
Okay, 3 of us are there right now. Wonderful.
Yeah, and I don't know if you saw Bill, at least from his note. I don't think his JP he's a very humble guy, so we will not read his his bio.
No, I totally agree with him because people have the bio, and Bill does a great job of this anyway. He's been doing it for the last 15 years. And I like being short and sweet. So that's the way we'll do it.
Great. And at least when I do my intro, I'll mention at least that Bill will help moderate the session, and obviously as questions come in, that we'll address them at a good point throughout the presentation. So got a lot of content, which is I think a good problem to have. JP,
and this is, and I'm sure you'll make the point that this is a unique platform for people to raise their questions, not only of John, but of each other.
Well, exactly. And I have that at least in my intro to make it as interactive as possible, not only to them, but also sharing best practices for everybody in the call for sure. Yeah.
And today as well as ongoing in the future.
Correct.
Wonderful.
That's the goal. Great. Well, thank you guys for setting this up.
Hey, Bill.
Yes.
Wanted to get your opinion. Jean very rightly recommends more frequent supply, which probably goes against the grain of the security mindedness of clinical trial executives. So I just wanted to alert you of that twin-sided problem.
More frequent supply what?
He talked about more frequent supply of goods for the tests. And I'm assuming, and I'm sure you clarified this, I'm assuming that depending on the most recent, accurate, timely information about enrollments, that goods are shipped out. And he's suggesting that they be done more frequently.
Oh yeah, I agree. Well, depending on where the site is, if it's let's say a U.S. site or a European site, yeah, some sites you can't do more than once a month, once every 3 months, even if it's a place in South America.
And fantastic. That's the real angle. Depending on the delivery cycle, that has to be factored into the frequency. I totally agree. Wonderful.
Great. Let me at least just ping JP. Give him a quick message. How are you guys doing this morning? Good? Devendra, nice and...
Yeah. Really good.
Is it 7:50?
Yeah, 7:50. I'm not a morning person, so it takes me a while.
We had this conversation and setting up the time. I'm not either, so
It's okay. That's fine. That's good.
I definitely feel you guys. I'm from California, but I never, at least that was when I was younger, so never had the work experience of obviously earlier calls. So usually most things are around EST for sure. At least I see. Usually Eastern time for sure.
I hope he can get in.
If he logs in, he can.
Yeah, I told him, I gave him the registration link.
Yeah,
So
it was very smooth for me.
he should have it.
Who has his presentation? Only Jean, or you have it too?
I have it. It's just easier, obviously, as he's going through the bulk of the presentation. I really just at least do the intro, so he shares it at least from his side, and clicks along to the slides.
Can you text him?
I just messaged him on Slack, so
Okay, I just changed my name.
Did you?
Yeah.
Bill Coakley.
Yeah. Before it just said BSMA.
Yes, you're right.
So I don't see your name.
Can do you see my name? No, you don't, right?
No.
it says
I changed it.
in post.
Yeah.
I changed it.
Okay, so I don't think you can share show screen, Jake.
Let's see. All right. Zoom. Hold on, I'm trying to get JP on here. It does give me the option, but I can test it in a second.
Are you good now, Bill?
Yeah, okay.
Holding in there. He does not see the Zoom link, so I'm gonna at least get him set up right now. We'll make it real quick. Because I don't want to give him my link, because obviously my link, I think upon registration gives you a personalized link. So I will make sure.
Just send him oh, there he is.
Yep, I did. So we should be able to get in a second. Let me test screen share.
I should be there. Hello. I need to
There he
change
is.
my background, I see.
Hi, John. How are you?
There we go. Same.
Wonderful.
I love technology. How you guys doing?
Good.
Doing really well. We were breathless until you got on.
I'm sure. Giving him a heart attack.
Oh no, you know, that little extra kind of stress that helps always very good.
Yeah. A good amount of stress. JP, can you test the fact that you can share screen? Hopefully you have an option down at the bottom. I know I do. But...
Yeah, it's the host disabled participation screen sharing.
Oh, so they
Well,
oh,
yeah,
it does say host disabled. So if you right click, I think, on his name, you should be
I will. Yeah.
You should be able
Share or share video, stop video, make host, make co-host. Terrific. You are the co-host, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. There we go.
Do that.
And there it is.
And I still can't see you. That's really nice. Let's see if I go to, yeah, I can still see you. That's nice.
Love it.
So we should be, set to go. 4 minutes in time, early in time.
Great, look at that. Might be a record. Might be a record for us.
Okay, I have myself in. Oh, it changed the view for some reason, so I need to change it back to the gallery view.
For you, yeah, I think when you share screen, it does change. Because I think then, obviously, since you started sharing screen, sometimes it changes automatically to that.
Who will be able to launch the poll question? Devendra, is it you or Bill?
We may have it. May have it through talking, and at least having them put it in chat. Because on slide 3, at least when he talks about push versus pull, yeah, I think at the end of that you indicate and just have them at least put it through the chat box. I think would be easiest.
Yeah.
Unless you built it, I don't think you built the poll into it, Devendra. I'm assuming you have probably like a free version of Zoom. So either way, the chat box works just
Yeah, I just tested it.
great.
And what I will try to do, if I can keep up, is if there's a disturbance in the background, I will mute them.
Yeah, that would be great. That's usually my job when we're in when we're in our own webinars in Zoom. There's definitely some that kind of leave their mics on, so that would be great. That would be great. And we will wait. I think there are some people at least joining us, so.
Yep, we have 5 people so far.
Give it a couple of
6.
minutes. Hello, hello, welcome. Just waiting for everybody else to join before we get started.
Yeah, we got. Dun, 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 bum, bum, bum.
Yeah, sometimes I wish we had some elevator music in the beginning.
Yeah, this one is a great idea.
If only.
Music from Star Wars or something.
Yeah, that just passed May 4th. That would have been nice if it was a week ago.
Right.
Yeah, we'll probably give it a couple of minutes, at least after the start, Devendra, I'm assuming.
I think it'd be a good idea for you to be kind of talking and welcoming for maybe a minute, minute and a half,
Great.
and then launch it about 90 seconds into it.
Sounds great. So welcome to those who are joining us. As just mentioned, we'll give it a couple of, give it a minute or two, obviously after the hour, and then we'll get started. Yeah, definitely some more people popping in, which is great. Great. Nice to see more participants. Good. We are, again, as just mentioned, we are just giving it a couple of minutes, let people kind of jump in. And then, yeah, we will get started very shortly. We have a lot of content to go through, so I know JP's rearing to get going, but we'll give it a minute or two.
I think when we hit the number 20 participants, we should launch.
We should get there pretty quickly. So great, and it's recording. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Great. So I think with that, I think we will get started. Just hit the 20 mark. So thank you, obviously, for all of those joining us today. I know everybody's schedule is crazy busy, so obviously we appreciate your time in these kind of industry conversations, as we like to call them. So thank you for joining us today. Obviously, the live webinar focused on clinical forecasting and demand planning for a patient-centric supply chain. This webinar is brought to you by 4G Clinical in partnership with Bio-Supply Management Alliance, obviously BSMA, as most of you should be familiar with. So 4G Clinical, for those of you who don't know, is a global leader in randomization and trial supply management and supply forecasting optimization software for the life sciences industry. So we offer the only fully cloud-based, 100% configurable and flexible solutions that utilize natural language processing to accelerate your clinical trials. So this webinar is slated for 1 hour. We again, as mentioned before, even briefly in the intro, I really want to make sure that this is a conversation as much as possible. So please feel free to use the chat function as much as possible. Obviously, we like to kind of stick to the flow of the presentation that we have planned, but please feel free to ask questions. Obviously, if our presenter, JP, stops at any time at the end of a section, feel free to unmute, ask a question. We like this to be really an industry conversation more than anything. So again, appreciate your time being here. Again, Bill Coakley, who is here on the call, will help moderate the questions as they come in through the chat box. I think with that, I will hand it over to Jan-Peter Capella, our presenter, at least for this webinar, to kick us off. JP?
Great, thank you so much, Jake. Thanks for the introduction, and also on my behalf, thank you very much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to talk about a couple of challenges that we are running into in the industry, and see how we can respond to that in a way that there's good control on our supplies. I'd like to start off maybe with a little bit of principle of supply chain management. And so we often hear or use the terms a push supply chain versus a pull supply chain. And for those that are maybe not fully aware of the differences, I just wanted to start it off with putting the spotlight on both of them. So if we start off with a push supply chain concept, the way that the supply chain is behaving is really pretty much anticipating any kind of future demand that is expected to happen. And as such, production is generally done based on a demand forecast. I think that is not rocket science, and makes a lot of sense to most of us. If you would compare that to a pull supply chain, that is behaving differently, because it's not going on demand forecast, it's going on demand triggers coming from what's called consumption. So when a unit is being used in the supply chain, that triggers a demand signal, and that demand signal is then going to be used to get the supply chain in motion. Just examples that come to mind if you talk about pull, I think we see it on a daily basis. A grocery store, replenishment of all your daily grocery activity. You just take something from the shelf, you just go to the cashier, you pay it, and instantly when your payment is done, the system knows that a unit is consumed by me because I bought it. And so in the next kind of replenishment of that product on the shelf, it's going to be replaced because I purchased it. The characteristics of supply chain is really obvious. So push, it's typically a slow kind of, pushing kind of an effort, larger production quantities, very infrequent production moments. It's relative large shipments that you see in the supply chain. And what you typically see is a lot of inventory in the supply chains. And as a result of the high inventory levels, there's often a lot of waste. But there's also a lot of risk averseness in supply chains like that, because the future is uncertain and we just want to be prepared for a high level of uncertainty. Pull characteristics, it's small productions, it's more frequent productions, it's a lot of shipping activities. Generally, the inventory levels are low, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But there's still inventory in the supply chain for good reasons. But a pull supply chain is known for being very agile. It can respond rapidly to changes that are happening into the supply chain. The second slide on concept, and then I'll stop with concepts, is more about the concept of what we call the decoupling point. So here's a simplification of a end-to-end supply chain that you can think of. And the decoupling point is really that place in your supply chain where you are moving from make to stock, which is a push model, into a make to order, which is a pull model. And the principle of pull supply chain is that the decoupling point is pulled back into, or upstream, I should say, in the supply chain, far away from where the real consumption is. So let's take an example to make this more understandable. If you think about buying a new car, for instance, so you can either use maybe a car configurator and really design your own unique car with all the different options that you have. And when it's all completed, you just push the button and an order is going to be placed in the manufacturing location for this company. So that's a make to order kind of a signal. And what is happening from the moment that you push the button, it's like the very first next production slot that's available is going to be reserved for you. And that production slot is going to make your beautiful car exactly to the specification that you asked it for. But that same car dealer also has a huge kind of parking lot with a lot of new cars standing out there, literally available for you to take home as you want. So those cars are really built in a make to stock kind of model. And so the dealer has come up with what is probably the model that you would like. And he took a lot of assumptions there, and hopefully you make the right one, because your choice is only, do I like that car or do I not like that car? You cannot change anything anymore. So I hope that is helping understanding the difference between a make to order, which is a pull strategy, and a make to stock, which is a push strategy. So if we take this back into our own industry, there's a kind of, examples that you can come up with how we as an industry can become more, leaning towards a pull supply chain. And the examples that you see here is making use of kit types that can be used in multiple countries or regions. You can also think about the simplification of a distribution network. So do you really need all the in-between kind of inventory locations, or can you simplify the distribution network? And then more common solutions are pooling of supplies between different studies. And we are seeing more and more some concepts of just-in-time labeling, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later in this webinar. So what's holding us from, behaving more like a pull supply chain and get away from the push supply chain? So I think I'm not going to read through all of this, but we know that there's a lot of uncertainties that we are dealing with in managing clinical trial supplies. So on one side, we have the demand variations, and one of the leading parameter there is how enrollment is predicted versus how it's really happening in the study. But you also have a lot of variations, maybe with weight-based dosing, different titrations, dropout. And unfortunately, protocol changes are not uncommon. And so sometimes they are impacting how the supply chain needs to be designed. On the supply side and distribution side, also some kind of challenges. So with short expiry periods, it's becoming more difficult to move the supplies in time to the point of consumption. There may be manufacturing capacity limitations. There may actually be some shortages on your drug product or your comparator. So all of those components are just, adding up to variation that we try to address in our clinical supply chains. But one thing is for sure, with this number of parameters that are indicating variations, we are quite often facing scrap in the end when the study is completed. And in itself, that doesn't need to be a wrong thing, but quite often what we see is that the supplies have been moved most far in our supply chain to the point of usage at the hospitals and the sites. And if you think about the costs that we have added, it's the highest cost already applied to the product that is not going to be used and scrapped. So that if we have different ways of preventing that, that would be a high benefit for our supply chains. Just pausing to see if there was a question. Cool. All right. So we have all these variations. Let's just take that into a more concrete situation. How can we prepare at a study level to make sure that we are not putting a patient at risk that when they show up in the study, that there's no drug available to be administered? So what I would like to do is start looking into how we can prepare best. And before going there, I want to review with you the different demand triggers that we need to identify, because these triggers are behaving differently and are requiring us to prepare our supply chain differently. So high level, there's kind of two levels. I would say at the bottom part, the predictable demand. Predictable demand is relatively simple. Patients have already shown up in the study. The treatment plan is very simple. Each and every visit, the patient is getting the same product. There's no expectations on patient being dropped out. So the demand for these patients can be predicted very accurately. On top, you see the opposite of that. It's called the unpredictable demand. And the unpredictable demand has two components. And the first part is on top there. It's called the uncorrelated, unpredictable demand. What it really means, it sounds very complicated, but it really means the unpredictable demand that's related to patient enrollment. And so patient enrollment is something that is hard to predict. And as long as the patients are not visible, you can only make some assumptions when they may come in. If you compare this to the middle part, where we call the correlated unpredictable demand, that is slightly different, because now a patient has already arrived at your hospital, at your site. So we know there's a patient that is potentially going to enroll in this study, but we do not know yet, whether this patient will be screened successful, or how randomization will look like, or when this patient is already in treatment, but we are having titration or dropout. We do not know exactly what the future demand for this patient is. So let's keep these three components in mind: uncorrelated and correlated unpredictable demand, and then the third part, predictable demand. The graph on the right side is giving us simply a visualization of what this means if you take this to individual sites, because each site is behaving differently. Patients start coming in at some point in time. Maybe there's more patients on one side than on the other side. Maybe one side is having more patients on one treatment arm than the other side. So my point is, each site is unique, and you need to make sure when you prepare for safety that you do that at each and every site level unique. Okay. Sorry. So this is probably something that sounds very familiar. How do we typically prepare at a site level from drug availability to make sure that we have the drug that is needed when patients are showing up at the site? So at the bottom graph, you can see it's a representation of what the demand at a certain site can be. And you can see at the beginning, it's just, increasing as patients are showing up. And while the treatment is ongoing, there's some variation. And towards the end, you see, a decrease of the demand at the site level. I think quite typical and good representation of what can happen at your study at each site level. And then the bottom graph is giving this typical kind of inventory projection graph that is, related to respond to the demand that is for the same site. And we as supply chain professionals really only have two simple questions that we need to answer. And so the first question is really like, when do I need to supply? And the second question is, how much do I need to supply? And that gets into this trigger and resupply parameters that we probably all are very familiar with. The one thing that we always want to make sure, if you think about the trigger level, which is the orange line here in the bottom graph, that the inventory, which is represented by the blue line, is never really getting to zero, because that really means that you are running out of stock and you are not able to supply the patient. So I want to start with the calculation of the trigger level, and then later in the webinar, I'm going to the resupply level. But let's start with the trigger. And let's start with the trigger level and only start looking into patient enrollment. I think we always get this message from our development organization or from the CRO that they have certain assumptions on how enrollment is going to be at each and every site level. And this is a simplification, and maybe there's 3 different site groups. There's a low, a medium, and a high site group. And the assumptions are different for each site group. So the low is enrolling half a patient per month on average, and the high is, assumed to enroll 4 patients per month on average. So that's in itself not very complicated. But the question now really comes, how do we prepare ourselves best from a trigger level point of view to be prepared for these different strategies? And so when I say the trigger level is really the inventory level that we want to have at the site that is sufficient to replace inventory at the site level. And so the time that you need from placing an order for the site, getting it, picked, packed, and shipped and released at the site, the timing from the order creation to the available at site is what I call in this presentation the short window. So the short window in this example that I go for is 14 days. So basically, on average, what we would expect is there's a 0.25 and 1 and 2 patients for the different site groups that we would expect coming into this study. But, it's not as simple as that. Because if you think about patients arriving at an individual site, that distribution is defined by a Poisson distribution. So let me take you through the example and try to make this as simple as possible. Let's just only focus on the bottom graph. So the bottom graph is a representation that I have 4 patients per month on average that I expect, and my short window is 14 days. So what the Poisson distribution is telling us that for this 14-day period, I have, a likelihood that basically no patient comes in the 14 days at all. So 0 patients are arriving in my 14 days. And the Poisson distribution is calculating to me this to be 16%. I have, 29% probability that 1 patient may show up in 14 days, 27 that 2 patients show up, etc., etc. So I think you're understanding how this works, that you need to start looking into what is the likelihood of how many patients can actually show up in this short window of 14 days, because that number of patients you need to get prepared for from a drug supply point of view. So the main question now is like, what is the situation that you feel comfortable to be prepared for? And, there's a different kind of a view that you look, but basically the main question is, what's the confidence level that you want to build out in your trigger level calculation to be prepared for different kinds of scenarios that can happen at a single site? So it can be a 75% probability, it can actually be 95%, it can be 99%. So without really going into the detail, if we stay with the bottom graph, but you can see the 75%, probability relates to 3 patients that may show up in this short window of 14 days. 95% probability relates to 4 patients and 99% relates to 6 patients. So this would be a question that you as expert need to answer. Is it okay that we take a little bit of risk and that maybe we don't have supplies at the site when we get an unexpected high number of patients showing up in a short period of time? Or is it not acceptable, and do you want to seek high levels of confidence that you are always prepared from a safety stock point of view? So we only spoke about patients that still need to show up in our study. And let's just take this example of the bottom graph that we still keep with an assumption of 4 patients per month. And let's just assume we feel comfortable with 95% confidence. So what I need to be prepared for is that I have supplies for 4 different patients that can show up in my short window. But this is just patients showing up, and we haven't really talked about what does this mean for the dispensing to these patients. So let's just, again, keep this simple and think about a study model where we have a simple 1-to-1 ratio of 2 treatment arms, and the dispensing is 1 of ABC in one arm and 1 of placebo in the other arm. So I think when we ask ourselves how many patients will end up in the ABC treatment arm versus the placebo treatment arm, on average, we would say 50%. But in reality, it's never 50%, or I shouldn't say never, it's not very often exactly 50% at the site level. And there's always some level of skewness. And that level of skewness is coming from this randomization, which is behaving as a binomial distribution. Again, this is the last graph that I'm, putting in front of you with statistics. And from here, hopefully, I can show it in very simplistic ways moving forward. So let's focus on our 4 patients that are showing up, and we have a 1.1 ratio to the 2 different treatment arms. So it's the middle graph, and you can see actually with the binomial distribution what the likelihood are 0 patients, 1 patient, 2 patients, 3 patients, or even all 4 patients will be randomized to the treatment arm A. And so again, we can apply these kind of confidence levels. And I think you're probably getting it, that the higher we are putting the confidence dials, the higher we need to, for the higher number of patients, we need to be prepared again from a supply point of view. So to wrap up my example on the previous slide, where there's 4 patients that are expected to come in the short window, and if again we choose the same 95% confidence level to be prepared for randomization to treatment arm A and B, it basically means that both for my ABC SKU as well as for my placebo SKU, I need to be prepared with 4 units on site for this inventory. Is this clear, or are there any questions on this?
JP, hi, it's Bill Coakley. I do have a question. In addition to the probability impacting the inventory level, is there a way to add additional elements to this, such as lead times? For example, if you wanted to have one inventory level for those that would typically get shipped in a couple of days, US, EU as an example, versus others that could take several weeks to reach their sites, possibly South America and other areas of the country. Is this a one size fits all, or is there a way to have different applications depending on variables such as the ones I just described?
No, it's definitely responding to multiple kind of parameters. And if I quickly go back here in where I was explaining on the number of patients that may show up in the short window. So your lead time is related to the short window. If you do a shipment from the US to the sites, maybe your short window is only 3 days, 3 or 4 days. And so the number of patients that can show up in only 3 or 4 days is much smaller than, if that window is 14 days, which it could be maybe in Latin America. So the parameter of lead time is really directly related to this buffer level, so to say.
Okay. Thank you.
And so far we have kept it simple, and maybe it's not felt simple to everybody, but there's hope. So bear with me one slide, and then I'm getting into the hope model. But so far we only looked into patients that are showing up at the site and they are being randomized for their first dispensing activity. All look simple, but what we wanted to get into, and that's also the purpose of this webinar, what if my study is not that simple? So what if, I have a much more complicated design in my initial randomization and my first visit? So this example, basically we have screening visit here, and there's a 10% screen fail. So that's, a parameter that we need to factor in. Now we have a randomization of 2-to-1, 2 different treatment arms. And in each treatment arm, you can see, a weight-based, component for dispensing. And you can also see a kind of, blood sample response dosing. So a single patient now suddenly has many more paths where he or she can find himself ending up. And based on where they end up, now suddenly the dispensing is completely different. So it's 4 units ABC, 2 or 1, or the same on placebo. So if you now would like to make your calculation, how do I make my trigger level at a safe level with 95 or 99%, this is becoming quite more complicated to do this maybe on an Excel solution. And here really things where technology is coming in, here's where depending on the solutions that you have, either your RTSM/IRT system comes in, or your clinical supply forecasting system comes in. And it gets, go ahead.
Before we go on, I think Sanjay, you had your hand up, and I think in the participants tab. Do you have a question?
Yeah, so thank you so much. And first, I want to say thanks to Mr. Jain for this visibility. This is Sanjay Desai here, and I'm in Singapore. So very happy to sit in this call, and very good morning to you. One question, Mr. Jain, and I'm not trying to be over complex about it, but the examples that you gave are very apt. Would the parameters for demand and supply replenishment be the same if we move to a e-clinical trial or e-clinical management? Would those parameters be very different because the geographies could be different, and rest of the other dependencies also could be actually different?
Thank you so much, Sandeep, for joining, especially at this late hour for you. And I think the question, if I understand, is, are you referring to decentralized clinical trials?
Yeah, decentralized, and as well as more on e-clinical, where
Yep.
we would go to the patients rather than patients coming to the site. So it won't be a very site-specific demand, supply, replenishment model.
Correct. Yeah, no, it's going to change. And I'm not saying that it's going to be simpler, but it probably is more or less related to the point of dispatch of the shipment that is then going to the patient. What I'm seeing in today's kind of study designs that are going in a direct-to-patient or more decentralized trial model, I still see often that shipments are done from a physical site instead of maybe from a central pharmacy or maybe from a central LSP in the region or in the country. But so the dispatch point is one of the differences. But there's also other components that come into the equation, and that has a lot to do with, I would say, the experience level that's at the sites to manage inventory versus the inexperience level of patients, managing inventory of their drugs. And so the safety buffers need to be, adjusted for that inexperience level that the patients have. So the behavior is similar, but there's new components of variation coming in as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jain. Really appreciate it. Over to you again.
Thank you for your question. Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. And so if we make this study design as an example even a little bit more complicated, and basically we're looking here what I call a patient treatment tree. And this patient treatment tree is presenting all possible kind of paths that an individual patient could go through when he or she is progressing through the study treatment. But what we talked about is the short window period and only related to patients showing up. But in fact, what we need to do, so this is basically the short window that we looked at. As patients progress in the treatment, their short window kind of demand triggers are changing. So, you know, when they get from to visit 1 to visit 2, there's different kind of probabilities that come in, and the same from visit 2 to visit 3, and the same, etc., etc. So basically, what is important is that you need to start calculating not only, you know, what the safety level needs to be for patients that are to be enrolled in the study. You, at the same time, also need to be prepared for all the variation that can happen while the patient has enrolled in the study, and treatment may change while they move through this patient treatment tree. So this was all related to the safety level, so the trigger level, to make sure that we have a minimum inventory level. And the next slide, I would like to get into how do we prepare for the resupply level. So the resupply level, basically that's the ceiling of your inventory level, the max kind of inventory that you plan to put within an individual site or, you know, an inventory holding location. And the resupply level is mostly related to the period that you want to cover for future demand triggers. And so to make this really simplistic, if I only want to be prepared for one period, then, you know, only the demand from this long window, which represent 2, is applicable. But if I want to be prepared for the double time period, so my long window gets 4, you know, I suddenly get more visits in, long windows getting 6, I'm getting more visits in. The more visits I'm getting in, the more products I need to put on stock to make sure that I can treat all the patients that are showing up at the different visits. So basically, you know, calculation of what is the best resupply level is again an exercise that I would highly recommend to do in technology. And so we have now talked about the trigger level and the resupply level, and I mentioned so many times, you know, technology. So the next step I would like to make is take a look at the technology. But this is maybe a good moment to see if there's any questions in the chat, Jake.
I don't think so. Bill put a reminder, obviously, for the chat feature, but I don't see any as of right now.
All right. So now let's take this into the technology. Again, we have seen the graph already on the left side, which is a representation of what the demand at a site level can be. And what I basically did is on the right side, make a calculation of a trigger and resupply strategy with the trigger set at 10 and resupply level at 30. And you can actually see very well how the inventory is going to be predicted, I have to say, because, you know, this is all assuming a lot of assumptions on the different parameters. But you can see a very nice kind of prediction of how inventory evolves. And you can also see that if the demand is really coming in as planned, we are expecting about 8 shipments. And on average, which is the green line, you can see the average inventory is expected to be around 16 to 17 units. So in itself, you know, it feels like a strategy that is not really bad and could do a good job for me. But what I'd like to do is do a little bit of a test whether there's different strategies that can do a better job for me. And that's where the 2 bottom graphs are coming in. And what you can see, I actually start playing with my resupply levels. I carefully stayed away from playing with the trigger levels. So obviously you can do that. But I'm already seeing that I'm just getting close to my 0. So I didn't want to, you know, run the risk of getting out of supply. So kept my trigger level at 10. And I played with the resupply levels to set it to 20 and to set it, actually, I should have said here 50. Sorry for that, that's a typo on my end. And what you can see just visually very quickly is the different kind of inventory projections that are coming out of this model suddenly. So in the middle, we see many more shipments, but the average inventory has now reduced from 16 to 12. So we're just keeping less inventory on average at this inventory holding location. And the opposite, if you increase the resupply level to 50, you can see we are reducing on the number of shipments, but the average inventory goes up very rapidly to 26.2. So what's the purpose of doing these scenarios? It's really looking for, are there better ways of defining supply strategies for this site? And there's different elements that get in there. If your shipment is really expensive, probably you don't want to end up with the middle example, because then you're increasing your cost very rapidly. But if you're having very expensive investigational product comparators, or if you are running short on supplies, you probably don't want to put the bottom one in place, because you're shipping a large quantity at once to a single site, and that is pretty much lost for the rest of the sites, as it's just waiting there for being consumed. So the concept of playing with the resupply levels, I'd like to take that back into what can we now do if we want to bring it back more to these supply pool strategies. And I just clicked one too fast, so maybe you didn't see exactly where the change is coming. But pool supply, so if we take a look at the top left graph, the demand over time, you can actually see in the demand periods 1, 2, 3, and 4, there's no demand. And that's, very realistic. It's not always that when a site is activated that the next day there's a patient. It can take a couple of weeks before the first patient is coming in. So one of those pull principles that really talk about you should, respond to demand triggers, there's no demand trigger yet, so we shouldn't do anything. So what does it mean? Instead of shipping your initial supplies at site activation, is there a chance that you can postpone that moment of shipment till this very first patient has showed up at the site? So when this patient is in screening, you may still have enough time to put your supplies at the site, and at least there's a patient, so there's a likelihood that your inventory is going to be consumed. Another thing that you can do, and that's still related to this early moment, is maybe introduce an artificial visit in your patient treatment tree. And the artificial visit could be a randomization visit where the site is randomizing the patient in the visit a couple of days or maybe even a week before the patient is scheduled to come in for dispensing. And so this would be beautiful, because if randomization already happened, you know what the treatment arm is that the patient is going to be randomized to, and you can make a much more intelligent decision on what supplies to put at that site. The third thing what you can do, and it's already represented in the graphs on the right, do not put your initial shipment, site shipment, up to the maximum of the resupply level. You could do it, but what if this site is not bringing in any patient? Then you're again ending up with all that supplies that is at the site level. It's probably a better and still a safe kind of strategy that you put your initial supply much lower, just a little bit over the calculated buffer level. But as soon as the first patient comes in and get randomized and dispensed, you will get a next shipment in that is then going to make up the remaining inventory to bring you back to the resupply levels. And then the last kind of pull strategy is quite obvious, is coming from the middle part of our graph, increase your shipment frequency. And as a result of the increase of your shipment frequency, you do not have to, put that much supplies up to the site level. And if there's no consumption of that supply, at least you're not losing too much of the inventory that's held at that stock level. Any questions on this? Because what I'm presenting on the right side of the graph is coming across as really static. So you see this buffer line, you see the trigger line as a kind of a constant over time. In reality, I would expect that probably you are assessing trigger and buffer levels a couple of times while the study is being executed. But quite often, I'm also hearing from supply chain managers that they know that they have to do it, but they simply cannot find the time really to make the calculations and do the checkpoints whether the trigger and resupply strategies that are assigned to the sites are the best ones. So hopefully in real life, you would make a couple of moments that you recalculate the levels, but it's coming in as quite of an effort to make all those calculations. So where I want to go is really to the point where the technology really is coming in. So the question is, why would you want to do this calculation of your trigger and the resupply level a couple of times during your study? Why don't you want your technology solution doing that for you, and not a couple of times during the conduct of the study, but really on a daily basis? So if you have this technology helping you making these same calculations automated on a daily basis, you now suddenly can start thinking about introducing what we call a dynamic buffer trigger resupply kind of strategy. And so that's what's being reflected on the slide that we look at right now. So at the right side, we still have the traditional way with the more constant kind of trigger and resupplies. And on the left side, we see the equivalent supply strategies. But what you can clearly see is that the trigger and resupply levels are different over the course of the study conduct. And they are really different because they respond to the variation that is happening at that point in time in the study. So at the early beginning of the study, when we do not know when patients are coming in and when enrollment is starting, why do we want to front load the sites with a lot of inventory as we are still not sure that these patients are showing up? But as soon as patients are starting to show up, we need to start preparing ourselves that when these patients progress in the treatment, that we have sufficient supplies in the site. The same at the end. So if patients start ending treatment, then the need for demand is going down and variation is going down because we know very likely what are the last doses that we need to prepare for the patient. So we can really trim down the safety stock level and the resupply levels so that basically towards the end of the study conduct and execution, we're not left with any inventory, while in traditional models, you quite often, unfortunately find yourself with some remaining inventory at the site.
JP, quick question.
Sure.
It's Bill Coakley again. If I'm understanding this correctly, this model is for establishing replenishment levels at the site level. Can the same concept be applied at the distribution sites, at the country depot or regional level?
Absolutely. Yep. The concept is exactly the same. The issue is that the patient demand triggers are not really transparent in the depot level. And why is that? Because the individual patient demand is, aggregated over the long window lead time, so multiple visits. And you have multiple patients that may show up at the same site. So the demand of all those patients are combined. And that is the demand that you see at the depot level. So you're one step further away of applying real pull concepts because you don't have the real transparency to the demand trigger from the patient. But calculating them and then the dynamic component, they also apply to depot inventory levels.
Thank you. The second part of this question is many individuals have a demand that's sort of triggered by site seating once a site is open. How do you manage that in such a way that it eventually gets used for real demand and not just sits there forever as safety stock?
Yep. No, very good question. So if you just look, and I'm going to focus on the left side of the graph and move to the next slide. So here Basically, what you're seeing, the seating level is relative low, so 5 units here. So you're not front loading too much, and just for the simple reason, because patients may not show up. But if you think back about what I started off with, how patients may show up at your site, there's a likelihood of no patient showing up, but there's also a likelihood of 3 or 4 patients showing up. So you still need to be prepared for this 3 or 4 patients showing up from an inventory point of view. So that seating, front seating is still needed. But keep in mind what I just mentioned. If you have the luxury not to do that at site activation, but maybe when the first patient is being screened, or if you have the luxury that you can do the first site shipment when a patient is randomized, then obviously that initial seating level can be much lower.
Okay. I think one last question. I'm starting to get questions in from the audience. When you talk about the production frequency and push versus pull, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm assuming you're referring to the production size of the pack and label jobs, not the drug substance or fills, which often are fixed sizes or could have over a year lead time. So with that said, how do you account for variations in the supply chain, such as delays due to failed lots or investigations or what have you?
Yep. Yep. So no, that's very fair. So yes, to confirm, the focus when I speak about production or manufacturing is on pack and label. But what I mentioned also on the variations that are contributing to our uncertainty. And the manufacturing side, I also mentioned drug product and maybe comparator product availability. If that is getting the case, then you're dealing with a scarce inventory supply, and by definition, what you should do is prevent that there's large kind of quantities being put into the supply chain inventory, because you don't have that luxury. So what it really means, if you are dealing with short supplies from drug product of comparators, you have to face more frequent small productions. You have to face more frequent small shipments, just to make sure that you are not wasting any of that scarce inventory just to put it on a place where it's not really consumed.
Okay.
I saw
Mr. Jan, Sanjay here. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you. So, and not a question, but an inquisitive comment basically is as we go towards more dynamic and more towards pull model, right? Our inventory will keep on going down. Now, in an environment where, and this question was actually covered partially, and your last answer was very much on the dot. But my assumption is this, and that is, I just wanted to resonate with that is, as the inventory goes down and your patients suddenly come up, between the two intervals of 2 patients coming up, right, without having any data for us, how do we manage? Do we use freight as a hedge over inventory at that point of time to make supply available and then keep our inventory levels up? Is that the assumption here?
I'm not sure if I fully understand. So,
because we talked about dynamic kind of supply availability, right?
yeah.
So that we are trying to reduce inventory and then just keep as much enough and work on a pull basis, right? And
Correct.
do not even create any triggers for push mechanism, because there's the whole idea of having a pull. So as the inventories goes down and if your demand suddenly comes up, between the two the demand over lead time, once a supply is consumed by a demand, which was a surprise, how do we account for a demand over lead time?
Yeah.
Between the two demands, what is the supply that I'm going to get? Are we hedging a quick freight shipment and get the supply in so that your inventory levels are still there to accommodate for the next surprise demand coming in from the site?
I fully understand. No, thank you for clarifying. And the answer is no. So basically, that is all factored in the dynamic value of the trigger. So if you have one patient that's on treated is going to be treated today, and the next visit is next week Tuesday, and I want to be prepared for that, my dynamic trigger is just including both the demand for today as well as the demand for next week.
Okay, so it's a question of the time frames actually that you are going to use it and make it a dynamic one.
It is exactly. And it is also addressing the probabilities and uncertainty of titrations, weight-based variations, and all those kind of things.
Excellent. Just last inquisitive question. Have you considered only US, which is probably mostly surface, or some like an APAC environment where you generally have to ship cross border?
Correct. Yeah. So in itself, it's applicable all around the world. The parameter that is coming in play is the lead time. So what is the time it needs to get from A to B?
Yeah,
And there's another component, what's the certainty of getting it from A to B? Because if you need
exactly.
to do a customs declaration where there's
Yeah.
issues, then maybe it's not coming there.
Yeah. Maybe you need to just put the buffers up a bit considering all those calamities or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No,
Back to you, sir.
yeah, no. Thank you so much. So I think, we talked a lot about this dynamic buffers, and what it's really doing for you is really taking away the burden of doing the calculations yourself. And it's also taking away the burden of doing it frequently because technology is now doing it for you. And what is really cool is that all, components of demand are included. So as well predictable demand as all of the unpredictable demands. Okay. Yeah, I don't have the time to get into the system, but if you're interested, we can do that in a separate setting. But basically, the solutions that we offer as a company are an RTSM solution, and we're just looking at how the system is working in an RTSM solution. I just wanted to show you, we have these confidence dials that are built in, and the effect of the confidence dials is going to be visible on what are the trigger levels that we need to set for each and every different site. And you can see the difference in the numbers related to the increase of the compliance of the confidence levels. And on the right side, here's the resupply frequency, 28 days or 56 days. And you can see how quantities here are changing if we are changing the long window to a longer period. So it's very easy to play around, to do basically scenario planning yourself in the RTSM system. And when you have found the right kind of mix of dials for the long window and your confidence level, you can save those settings into the system, and they are being used for the daily calculations. So we have talked a little bit about distribution and manufacturing, and that's actually the last two slides that I quickly want to talk to. And thanks, Bill, for asking the question. And I started talking already about the components of, the distribution network. But to repeat, the demand trigger for the patient is really not transparent into the depot network. So if we take a look at a depot network simplified here from the US that is supplying UK and Europe depots, and Europe depot is supplying an Israeli depot, and then you see all the sites in the different countries participating, and you can see here, this is the question you asked Sanjeev as well, the lead time coming in. You can see a shipment from a depot to a site, maybe 7 days, but the shipment from the US depot to the UK depot is 35 days. So that's where your parameter of the lead time comes in for the shipments. But unfortunately, the patient demand triggers are no longer visible because the patient demand is accumulated for the different patients and for the long window. And as such, we are getting a lump sum of a distribution order that is visible in the depot network. Lead times, we talked about it. Expiry, it's a component that we need to prepare for. So if you are dealing with short expiries and the component of the do not dispense, do not count, do not ship comes in, then if we have an expiry only left for maybe 90 days, knowing that to ship them from the US to Europe, to Israel, to the sites taking 55 days, maybe there's the likelihood of being consumed before expiry is really low. So we should not underestimate the importance of not moving inventory through the network if there's no likelihood for being consumed. Product loss, excursions, or damages, they need to be planned for. And blinding is also a component depending on the strategy. If you ship to a site and that site is only having active patients, how do you want to make sure that blinding is ensured? Are you just adding a single kit of a placebo, for instance? And then in the end, the site is piling up all the placebos because none is consumed while all the active units are being consumed. So not one size fits all, but you have to find a strategy to respond to that. And when we take it back into pool strategy again, two kind of recommendations. The simplification of your network is the first one. Is there really a need for this Israeli depot? Or is there ways that you can ship directly from the US or Europe so that you're just eliminating that inventory holding location? There's good reasons maybe not to do it at the start, because at the start of the study you want to be ready to respond quickly. But when all patients are enrolled, maybe you can just plan for removing that depot. And then the last component is this manufacturing component, and just to repeat, manufacturing being the packaging and labeling. In my opinion, the way that we currently manufacture is really unfortunately driving us much more into this kind of push model in our supply chain. And there's good reasons for it. At least there's reasons for it. Maybe good is a question, but quite often we deal with frozen periods. You cannot produce at any point in time. You need to wait till your next available production slot. If you're working with a CMO, then you probably need to do some slot reservations to make sure that this capacity is reserved for you. We talked about this lead times in production and sourcing as well. Some of the comparator sourcing takes months. So you need to really early on make decisions how many units I need to source. Min-max or production frequency is having impact. All those kind of things are limiting basically our manufacturing ability to be much more responsive to pull signals and quite often find ourselves in a push model. So quite often, what can you do? It's not always that easy, but if you have a chance to come up with smaller and more frequent production batches, that's probably the first path to go. If you are finding yourself with those slot reservations, is there a way that you can make them much more flexible? Because if your next slot is 6 months from now, but your study really hasn't started enrolling patients, you probably don't want that slot to be used, because if you start producing at that point in time, it's for demand that's not there, and there's a likelihood of increasing your scrap from expiry. Continuous manufacturing, that's probably a topic for a separate webinar. Manufacturing 4.0. I think there's a lot that we can talk about, but that's concepts that come from other industries and slightly get into our industry. But other things that you can think of is more making your kits more generic, and that can be in different ways. Just have global kits with booklets, or pooling your supplies in different studies, so you are averaging your variation. And then the last option is in technologies called just-in-time production. Postpone the moment of making your kits unique, and then at late stage give them their country-specific labeling with the country-specific expiry and any relevant information that's related to the patient in that country. So that's basically wrapping up the webinar for today. So is there ways that we can think about how we can make our supply chains a little bit more responding to demand triggers? And I hope that I've been able to share that with you. And basically my message to you is, if you are in an urgent need to get more responsive and you want to get into more inventory scrap savings, we can help out with the technology solutions in that space.
Great. Like we said, lots of content. So we appreciate the questions, at least throughout the presentation. But if you do, JP, if you want to go to that last slide, just so that they have your email, again, feel free to reach out. We will, as obviously Bill mentioned, these slides will be available on BSMA, but we should obviously be following up with everybody who registered with the slides themselves. So we have additional information on pooling and JIT, obviously, that we didn't get into because of time, but we will obviously include those into the slides. So again, we appreciate your time. Don't want to hold you any longer, but if you do have any questions, feel free to follow up. And
Thank you, Jake, and thank you, JP. And as already mentioned, the slides for this, as well as a recording, will be available very shortly on the BSMA website. And if anybody's interested in learning more about BSMA or its various steering committees, and especially the Clinical Supply Chain Steering Committee, there is plenty of information on the site for you to browse through. I think we ran out of time for additional questions, but again, thank you everybody for joining.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.